Claudia, tell us, what kind of drivers and challenges addressed in the paper can we find in Colombia?
All the drivers and challenges are addressed in Colombia, but obviously we have ones that need to be stronger and ones that needs to be sort of driven off. If we start by the drivers, I see that the leadership starts by the Ministry of the Environment, and we need all the sectors to be involved, especially the Ministry of Economics and other sectors that are driving the economy of Colombia. Colombia wants to be part of the OECD countries, and its main objective is to have a strong economic sector. But obviously that starts by the mineral sector, by the petroleum sector, and by the agricultural sector. And if we need to mainstream climate change in those sectors, we need to start by the Ministry of Economics and by the planning process of Colombia. There is also a need to internalize this in many sectors and regions. In 2010 and 2011, we had a major disaster in terms of La Niña effect. It rained in Colombia, and 2% of the GDP was affected. So obviously the government is currently thinking about the climate, but is not driving the process into mainstreaming this through all the sectors. 80% of the energy sector capacity comes from water. So obviously it's very vulnerable to climate change. If we have more or less water, our matrix will be different. And in that respect, if we need to be efficient, we need to think about climate change. And I don't think that is happening in Colombia. And we need to internalize climate change into that matrix. We need to internalize it into the economic perspective of the energy sector as a whole. And there is obviously a need to bring more resources on climate change. But right now, we're viewing that as something that is technical cooperation from external countries and is not being internalized into the economic matrix of the country by itself. So there's obviously a need to internalize efficiency, cost effectiveness in all the energy and in general, all the sectors of Colombia, and to upgrade it to the economic level of the country in terms of planning, in terms of perspective, and in terms of vision.
Can you describe some of the areas for investment and delivering climate-compatible development where the private sector's involvement could be critical in Colombia?
I believe that the agricultural sector is the sector that understands most climate change, basically because in 2010 they had to suffer it, and they know that the commodities went up by about 20%. So at this stage, for example, crops like coffee, which is one of the main crops of Colombia, is ready to do climate-compatible development. For them, it's not only where to plant, but with which type of seeds to plant, how to work this with small scale holders, with small producers and big producers, and how to scale it up to be competitive in the future. So obviously coffee is one of the main sectors. We also see, for example, tourism. Also, although they're reluctant in a sense because their investments right now are sort of suffering due to climate change. In the case of Cartagena, they're building all this infrastructure which is right near to the coast, and they need to adapt to climate change. The investments to make them adapt to climate change will be very high. Another sector is also the transport sector. We are doing a project right now with CDKN in terms of internalizing climate change in the main roads of Colombia. And the private sector is building the roads of Colombia. They need to put more money in terms of their bidding processes and in terms of their construction processes in order to have roads that are adaptive to climate change in the future. For them and for the country, that will mean investing more right now, but having more cost effectiveness in the future. So I see those three sectors as the main three sectors that Colombia and the private sector is willing to address climate change right now.
Claudia, could you tell us of your personal experience in trying to engage business leaders in climate mitigation and resilience planning?
Business leaders need to understand competitiveness in terms of climate change. In the Colombian case, it has not been easy. Only the agricultural sector, because of the impact that they had in 2010 due to the rainfall understood what climate meant in through their commodities and their prices. But really, it has not been easy. If we take, for example, the coffee sector, they understand that they have to be competitive in terms of the global coffee sector, but they need to internalize climate change in their price level, and that sort of lowers their competitiveness of the future. However, if they see this in the longer term, they would see that adapting to climate change right now would mean to be more competitive in the future in terms of the global level. We also see other sectors, for example, the tourism sector of Colombia. The tourism sector needs to understand that climate change will be a factor. If we see, for example, in terms of Cartagena, all the major chains of hotels are willing to build infrastructure in the coastline. They need to understand that for them to be adaptive to climate change means to understand that the sea level rise will be an issue, and where to build their hotels, where to see the land use planning will be an issue for the future. For us, it has been sort of a challenge to address them in this sense, because for them, they want to have revenues right now. They're not seeing their revenues in 10 years or in 20 years. And that has been a challenge for us. We're fortunately understanding in a common vision that for them, that will be a factor. We also have another sector that is, for example, the transport sector. Right now, Colombia lacks infrastructure. We need to build many new roads. In that sense, in the bidding process that the private sector is doing right now, we need to include climate change. The way to address this is a challenge. We're obviously doing that with a project of CDKN involving the private sector in, first of all, understanding climate change. Second of all, understanding what means to build roads right now that are adaptive in 20 years, but also how would that interfere in terms of the costs that they need to do or to address in terms of climate change right now. Dear colleagues, thank you for allowing me to be present in this very interesting conference and meeting, here sitting in Colombia and avoiding by traveling CO2 emissions, which is part of the challenges of the climate of the future. I would address any of the questions that you have in terms of Colombia, one of the countries that is more vulnerable to climate change, and to make it obviously more compatible to the climate of the future. Thank you so much.